Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know you're having a wonderful time enjoying the camaraderie of your table, and so I apologize for interrupting that. I'm Andy von Eschenbach, and I have the honor to have been able to serve as the chairman of this celebration. Now, all of you know that means I got the title and everybody else did the work. And so I want to begin this evening with, first of all, welcoming all of you and thanking you for being present both here physically as well as those of you who are with us virtually on Zoom or WebEx and will be with us again tomorrow. Thank you for your willingness to be a part of this incredibly important celebration. I want to thank the people who made this possible. The staff of the Nixon Library and the Nixon Foundation have been absolutely unbelievable in their commitment and in their passion to being able to have us celebrate some of the progress that we've all been a part of. I particularly want to echo Jim's thanks to Ellen Siegel and Marlene Malik. You know, in the history of the National Cancer Act, you will know that advocacy was an extremely important part of that process. Someone like Mary Lasker, for example, probably this wouldn't have happened without her. Well, in Ellen and in Marlene, we have today's Mary Laskers. They have continued this passionate effort to continue to drive progress in cancer research and cancer care. And so we're tremendously indebted to you, not only for this conference, but also for what you're continuing to do through Friends of Cancer Research. In 1971, I was coming out of the Navy as a medical officer to start my residency in surgery and urology, and then in 1976 went on to MD Anderson Cancer Center for a fellowship and then on the faculty. And so in many ways, along with some of you, I have lived this dream. And it has been an unbelievable experience to see the progress that has occurred over these past 50 years. Tomorrow, we will spend time with 3 panels who will walk through some of that journey with us. The first panel will involve Nobel laureate basic scientists to talk about this revolution in science where back there in 1971, a physician like me was working in a paradigm of observing manifestations of disease, feeling a lump in a woman's breast, seeing a shadow on an x-ray and calling it a lung tumor. But what the National Cancer Act enabled us was to go from observing manifestations to being able to unravel fundamental mechanisms of cancer at the genetic, molecular, and cellular level. And that, of course, has transformed science. The second panel will focus on many of the advances that have been made in cancer therapy based on that progress in science and the infrastructure that the National Cancer Act created that has enabled a lot of that progress in saving lives and eliminating the suffering and death we are so familiar with regard to cancer. And the third panel will take that progress and project it into the future in which cancer and cancer's progress and foundation is now serving as a platform for all diseases. So what we will see in the future with a continued commitment is not being cancer-centric, but cancer-led, as this National Cancer Act has created a trajectory to transform all of diseases, acute and chronic. How that came about is really an amazing story. An amazing story of bipartisanship, an amazing story of collaboration and cooperation, and even an amazing story of compromise and commitment. To begin to introduce that, we have a film following which we'll have a bit of a discussion of some of the intricacies that went into So how did the National Cancer Act of 1971 come about, and the important role of the leadership of President Nixon? Roll the film.
On December 23rd, in the East Room of the White House, describing it as a Christmas gift to the American people, President Nixon signed the National Cancer Act of 1971.
We are here today for the purpose of signing the Cancer Act of 1971. And I hope that in the years ahead, that we may look back on this day and this action as being the most significant action taken during this administration.
Presidential involvement with cancer research had begun when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the National Cancer Act of 1937. In 1940, FDR drove to Bethesda, Maryland, to dedicate the National Institutes of Health, including, for the first time, a National Cancer Institute.
Among the buildings of the National Institute of Health to be dedicated here today stands the National Cancer Institute, created through provisions of the Act which I signed on August 5th, 1937.
Since its founding in 1913, the American Society for the Control of Cancer had tried to raise awareness of a disease so steeped in fear and stigma that it was rarely even named, much less spoken about in public. In 1938, philanthropists and activists Albert and Mary Lasker and their friend, pharmaceutical executive Elmer Bopst, took over the American Society for the Control of Cancer and rebranded it into the proactive American Cancer Society. Mary Lasker was a Democrat. She had been instrumental in President Johnson's funding of research and community health programs for heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Elmer Bopst was a Republican who had become one of the Nixon family's closest personal friends. Both Mary Lasker and Elmer Bopst would play vital parts in the National Cancer Act of 1971. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he had great hopes and plans for reforming the American healthcare system to assure that no American family would be prevented from obtaining basic medical care because they couldn't afford it. He had an early personal interest in cancer. His aunt, Elizabeth Milhouse Harrison, died of breast cancer when she was 38 and he was 17. Pat Nixon was 12 when her mother died of Bright's disease and a fast-acting liver cancer in 1924. As one of their earliest White House events, the new president and first lady welcomed American Cancer Society President Dr. Sidney Farber and cancer survivor and talk show host Virginia Graham to launch the Society's 1969 crusade. A number of advances in research and treatment encouraged the idea that major cancer breakthroughs were possible. And in December, Mary Lasker sponsored striking full-page ads in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other national papers. After a year of planning, in his January 1971 State of the Union address, the president made a bold challenge and a firm commitment.
I will also ask for an appropriation of an extra $100 million to launch an intensive campaign to find a cure for cancer, and I will ask later for whatever additional funds can effectively be used. The time has come in America when the same kind of concentrated effort that split the atom and took man to the moon should be turned toward conquering this dread disease.
A month later, he met with his science advisor, Dr. Edward David, and his Science Advisory Committee. He made it clear that he saw a cure for cancer as an inspirational goal that would capture public attention, while the real work would be done by supporting research.
As far as the country's needs, the symbolism of the goal. I mean, so it was when he told that they had a whole program there in this field. I think we have to look at it in two ways. One, which is, of course, find a cure or treatment for cancer. And second, the broader purpose of attracting public attention and developing public support for major efforts in medical research and support of those efforts in a very substantial way.
A few months later, he met with Dr. Charles Hoffman, president of the American Medical Association. Dr. Hoffman's granddaughter reads his account of that meeting.
President Nixon asked him, "Doctor, what do you consider the most pressing problem that medicine has today?" My grandfather later wrote, "My answer was simple: cancer." The president said, "I'm amazed. Why do you think that?" And my grandfather replied, "I think that every physician who is dedicated and sincere never goes on the floor of a hospital where he has cancer patients without feeling helpless. We always come away with the feeling that there's so little we can do."
Some notes the president made at this time, July 1971, show his thinking and his determination to be directly involved. "We have made great progress in research. The time has come for a consolidated, massive effort to find a cure for cancer. I have asked for $100 million in additional funds. I have set up a new independent agency reporting directly to the president." In October, President Nixon announced that Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, would be converted from a biological warfare facility to a cancer research center. The White House Domestic Council staffer working on the cancer initiative was Jim Kavanaugh. Today, Dr. Kavanaugh is chairman of the Nixon Foundation's board of directors.
In early 1971, after consultation with experts inside and outside the government, the president had decided that he would seek an additional $100 million for cancer research. He announced that decision in a State of the Union message that year, and the next day, legislation was sent to the Congress to enact the president's program. Hearings were held in both the House and the Senate. It was a tight year for money that year, and in addition, both houses, the Senate and the House, were in control of the party opposite from the president's. But he was persistent, and both houses had hearings, passed bills. The House bill, much more in conformance to the president's program than the Senate. The president communicated to the Senate that there were provisions in their bill that he could accept, that there were provisions in their bill that he could not accept, but he offered modifications to make them acceptable. The House and Senate conferees went back to work to modify the bill, passed it in both houses, sent it to the president for his review in late November of 1971. And then on December 23rd at the White House, at a ceremony attended by leaders from the House and Senate, various national organizations, the American Cancer Society, university experts in the field of cancer, and others, the president signed the National Cancer Act of 1971.
Both houses of Congress had Democratic majorities, and the White House Congressional Relations staff worked tirelessly with leaders like Representatives Paul Rogers and Anker Nelson, and Senators Ralph Yarborough, Edward Kennedy, and Jacob Javits.
The passage of the National Cancer Act of 1971 could serve today as a model of bipartisanship. But that's not to say there were not significant differences, not only between Republicans and Democrats, but between the House and the Senate. President Nixon's leadership was crucial in resolving not only these issues, but in stressing the importance of the National Cancer Act, which over 50 years has fostered a revolution in biology and is one of the most transformational pieces of legislation of the 20th century.
On December 23rd, when the president signed the National Cancer Act of 1971, he invited the large bipartisan congressional delegation to join him for an historic photograph.
This is an indication of the priorities. You know, the Congress had a very long session and finally got adjourned. We all appreciated that fact, incidentally. But once they adjourned, they did too. Once they adjourned and they were to go home and go on their vacations, to have this many members of the House and Senate who are members of the committee back here shows how deeply they feel. And I think that for that reason, we'd like to record this for a picture. So go ahead. We don't have to tell House and Senate members how to get in the picture.
Although the phrase war on cancer was widely used, President Nixon himself purposely never wrote or spoke those words.
We would not want to raise false hopes by simply the signing of an act. But we can say this, that for those who have cancer and who are looking for success in this field, they at least can have the assurance that everything that can be done by government, everything that can be done by voluntary agencies in this great, powerful, rich country now will be done. And that will give some hope, and we hope those hopes will not be disappointed.
In 1973, he requested a further $100 million, and in 1974, $100 million more. During his administration, more than $1.5 billion went to cancer research, helping to hasten the advances in molecular biology and immunotherapy and so many other areas.
Every day I see how research has changed and is constantly changing the treatments and the lives of young patients, which include the children that I work with in radiation proton therapy at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. With each research advancement, it brings new hope and comfort to patients and families. It makes me proud and inspires me to think about the difference that my grandfather has made, and about the living legacy he created 50 years ago on that December afternoon when he signed the National Cancer Act of 1971.
The National Cancer Act of 1971 established the independence of the National Cancer Institute and the tradition of direct presidential involvement. It focused a national conversation on cancer prevention. It created the National Clinical Trials Network. It created 15 designated cancer centers. Today, there are 71 nationwide, and that number continues to grow. In NCI's words, the National Cancer Act of 1971 gave our country an holistic approach to addressing cancer and its many challenges. This broad legislation gave new authority to the National Cancer Institute and established some of the programs that formed the backbone of today's cancer research enterprise. Most importantly, as a result of the National Cancer Act of 1971, lives were saved, lives were prolonged, pain and suffering were alleviated, and suddenly there was hope where there had been no hope before.
How would you like to be remembered?
I suppose everyone would like to be remembered particularly for his major achievements. But as I look back during the White House years, I think, for example, of an initiative which many people have forgotten, the Cancer Initiative. You remember we started that in 1971, and it was brought home to me just a couple of days ago. My brother, Don, has cancer. It's a very serious case. He's now taking radiation and chemotherapy. 10 years ago, his doctor told him he would be dead. So that initiative may have helped prolong his life and the life of other cancer patients. What I'm suggesting here is that we all think of, well, he went to China. He ended the war in Vietnam. He opened relations with the Soviet Union through détente. But in my view, if the Cancer Initiative, which we began, could save lives, that'd be worth all the rest put together.
You know, this is obviously a very sophisticated audience, so I'm sure you've all had the opportunity to either see Hamilton or listen to the soundtrack, and you know the importance of being in the room. We're really fortunate tonight to have two individuals who were in the room. Frank Gennon, who narrated that wonderful film, was a special assistant to the president at the time of 1971 and continued to be a part of the important process. Jim Kavanaugh was in the room as an assistant to not only President Nixon, but on to President Ford and President Reagan as well, and also spent time in the U.S. Public Health Service and was Assistant Secretary for Health as well. They were part of the genesis and the process that led to this act, and in many ways were architects of some of the important parts of the bill that were alluded to in the film that really enabled the NCI to step aside and be transformational in the way it was able to drive cancer research. So we thought tonight we'd have a little conversation led by Frank around how the bill came about and what some of the implications are, some of those important things that you, Jim, were able to negotiate in the bill. We'll call that negotiation. Fair enough.
Well, you're very kind. While I had my nose pressed up against the window, the back window of the room, Jim was running the room. So Jim was really the man who was present at the creation, the staff person assigned to the healthcare in general, and the National Cancer Act is part of that. There's I think, you see, if you've had a chance to visit the library, or if you'll have a chance to visit the exhibits tomorrow, you'll see that President Nixon, it's a cliche that he used yellow pads because it was so true. And these are the notes he made the night before the signing ceremony. This was the night of the 22nd of December, before the noon ceremony the next day signing the National Cancer Act. And in the video clip you saw, he began by saying that. That was the note he made, that this would be the most important action taken as a president. I came across there are hundreds of these memos dealing with the National Cancer Act. This was a memo on cancer research. It was a decision memo, so there were many choices for the president to check or not. And this is one page, and after having written against one too little and another one too drastic, this was what he said, okay, option 4 as modified. I want to look into this bureaucratic mess personally. I may, in the progress, learn something. I shall appoint a top White House staff man to write herd on the project. And this one thing shows that Nixon was, although it was a hidden hand presidency, but it was a hands-on presidency. He liked to deal with things on paper, and he looked at all the details down to this extent. The top White House man he appointed was Jim Kavanaugh. So between Jim, who was president at the creation, and Andy, who as National Cancer Institute director, steeped himself in the history and the backstory of the National Cancer Act. So here on stage you have an encyclopedic reference and a cornucopia of knowledge about the National Cancer Act of 1971. That said, Andy, you wrote that the National Cancer Act of 1971 was ingenious and transformational. Ingenious and transformational are two words not frequently used about federal legislation. How do they, explain?
Well, you know, when you look at the National Cancer Act and you go through some of the provisions that Jim was so influential in being able to negotiate into the bill, each of them have a very unique downstream impact. And I'll just reference a few. One of which was it gave the NCI the authorities to issue contracts. Now, up to that point in time, the predominant method of funding research was grants. And the idea is, give us your best ideas, and if your peers think it's great, we'll give you the money. This told the NCI, you now have the power to define what you want done. You can determine what that research should address. Then you can ask for the best ideas, and if the peers think they are, we'll award the money. The ability to award contracts for directed, specific initiatives really started to open the door to being able to dissect the process of cancer and understand those fundamental mechanisms. Quickly, just to reference another one, the ability to engage in public-private partnerships to create cancer centers. The bill included funding for 15 new cancer centers, and of course now, as we alluded to, we have more than 71. So it put in place a number of things that were in fact transformational, and they were ingenious in the sense that they said, there's a new way to do business. There's a new way to be able to drive research, to be able to solve a problem that's plaguing us, the problem of cancer. Jim, you had a lot of work to do in bringing about some of the agreement with some of those provisions.
Well, the president was very determined that he wanted a program, and he wanted a program that was directed at getting at the problem. And what we worked out with the Congress was ways and the mechanics of how to do that. And one of the authorizations that was provided to the NCI was the ability, as you referred to award contracts. Before that, science and the NIH process was all geared around grants, and it's whatever the investigator wanted to do with it, is they basically had the ability to proceed as long as it was within the guideline of the grant that they had applied for. And the authority to as you referred to, award contracts, which was fairly directed, was really new in the scientific community in terms of the government support. And from traveling around the country as I did shortly thereafter, and hearing people refer to the legislation, what were some of the big things that came out of it, that was number one in terms of having a direct impact on things that NCI could now bring about in the community that they were dealing with.
Frank, you alluded to Frederick in the video, and one of the other provisions of the bill was to enable the NCI to engage in public-private partnerships, to engage in private sectors and create FFRDC, federally funded Research and Development Center, so that only NCI had Frederick as part of its intramural program, in which it could do things by virtue of outreach that others couldn't do. And that was an important part of the president's strategy, wasn't it?
It was
convert
indeed.
Frederick?
Yes, it was indeed. He wanted to convert that facility, which had been making biological weapons, into useful purposes, and the NCI was the recipient of the laboratories out at Frederick, and that became a whole new era of cooperation between the private sector and government, and a new direction for NCI to move out on.
You mentioned in your video within the video that both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democratic Party. And Nixon, in fact, was the first president in 120 years since Zachary Taylor to have both houses against him throughout all his administration. And money was very tight, as you mentioned, and it was after the 69 election had been razor, 68 election had been razor thin. So it really required a great bipartisanship. First of all, leadership from Nixon and from the White House congressional relations staff to herd all these cats. But in the pantheon of people bipartisan people who made the National Cancer Act in 1971, who are your candidates for the Mount Rushmore of that pantheon?
From private, public sector, where from, Frank?
In Congress.
In Congress. Well, I'd certainly, Paul Rogers, who was a Democrat from Florida, played a very key role in it, both in terms of the House and in terms of the negotiations the conferees had when the House members went to the Senate in conference with Ted Kennedy and Jake Javits from New York. Paul Rogers led that situation. He led the legislative draftsmanship, and I'd say he was number one.
Was it ever a close call? Was there ever a point or points where it might not have happened? There might not have been a National Cancer Act of 71?
Well, yes, there were times. One of the critical times was in September of 1971 when the House had passed their bill, the Senate had passed their bill. They were different. The House bill was much closer to the president's program than the Senate. The House was due to go to conference with the Senate the following day, and the House wanted to understand what the president's position must be. And these were the Democratic members of the House as well as the Republican members. And they wanted to be well armed so that when they went into the conference with the Senate, they could say, well, we understand the president would support this, the president would not be for this, and we were able to send a memorandum into the president, got his position on it, communicated that to the members of the House. They took it to the conference the next day. They basically prevailed in the conference, and the bill that was enacted was much closer to the House bill and much closer to the president's program.
And how involved was Nixon? Because one of the criticisms of him is that in a lot of the domestic policies, he put them up partly to outflank the Democrats and partly just for to put them up, but wasn't really personally deeply committed to them. We know John Price was here a couple of weeks ago with his book, in which he put paid to that and Nixon's intense involvement with the Conference on Hunger and the guaranteed minimal income. How involved was he, hands-on, with this cancer?
Well, very hands-on. It began before the legislation was acted, began before he made his decision to seek the additional $100 million in federal spending. He participated in the consultation process of groups and individuals coming in, making their views known, what the needs were, what the opportunity was for additional support of federal research. He took that into consideration as he arrived his decision, which he made in January of 1971, to seek the additional $100 million. And then from time to time, as the legislation moved through either the House or the Senate, anytime there was a key decision that was made, a memorandum was prepared, went into the president. He checked off what his decision was going to be, and that became our marching orders, and we communicated that to the House and Senate, and he was directly involved in the structure of the bill.
I believe you were the staff member given the honor of inviting and hosting Mary Lasker at that signing ceremony, and you also knew the Bopst very well.
Well, I didn't invite Mary Lasker to the signing ceremony individually. That was taken care of by the staff that did that. She was included on the lift. What I did do is earlier, as we were putting the program together, call Mary Lasker and ask if she'd come in to have a chance to meet. She said, well, I don't want to know if I want to come into the White House. I said, well, you've been here many times before. She said, I know, but could we meet somewhere else? I said, well, I've got a schedule, and I know you do too, and you don't get to Washington very often, but if you could come by it, I'd appreciate it. So she called back and said, yes, I'd come back. I think this was a Monday, and she came in the following Thursday afternoon. And she came in the office, sat down, she looked around, and I said, is everything all right? She said, well, everything's fine. She said, well, I've never been in a Republican White House before. And I said, let me assure you, Republicans get cancer just as fast as Democrats do. You're right at home. From that, we went to work, and Mary gave her ideas. I was able to pass those on to the president, and we got along fine after that.
You know, one of the things I'd hope you both comment on is, in terms of the president's commitment to this, is, of course, the NCI director was to be a presidential appointment.
Yes.
There was some controversy around that, and
well, the bureaucracy didn't want it to be a presidential appointment. The president did. The president, you can see by his notes and his various decision memos, he was determined to have this authority different from everything else that was going on with the government. He really wanted it to work, and he thought having a presidential appointed director and a presidential appointed advisory committee would be one of the keys to making that work.
Yeah, I would have to echo, again, one of the provisions of the bill that was really profound was the creation of both the National Cancer Advisory Board and the President's Cancer Panel. The President's Cancer Panel was commissioned to go out and survey the public with regard to the problem of cancer and report back to the President on a periodic basis. And of course, the National Cancer Advisory Board was made up of both scientists as well as representatives from the community to help advise the NCI director. Also, there was the budget. It was what we euphemistically refer to as the bypass budget.
What is the bypass budget?
It did not have to go through NIH and the Department of HEW.
Correct.
But went directly to the president and was worked and negotiated.
That's correct.
From the president to Congress.
Right.
You want to comment on some of the struggles with that? Because some of the people in the room will realize it's a quite timely discussion, because today there's a provision that's being considered for ARPA-H, which is a health kind of corollary to DARPA. And the question is, should it be an NIH? Should it be an independent agency? Should the person be a presidential appointment or appointed by? How did that all play out in some of those tensions?
Well, the bureaucracy and some of the really good people in the government, people that the president had appointed, were in departments and agencies that resented the fact that they were going to lose control of a major part of the National Institutes of Health through having this presidential appointed director and presidential appointed advisory committee. But the president was determined to see that happen, and and he kept pushing away at it and kept making decisions to amend the legislation to ensure that it didn't slip back into the government bureaucracy. I noticed the first time this evening I came in and saw the exhibit, and I saw the decision memorandum that went into the president, and it said who was opposed to the legislation, who was in favor of it. One of the people opposed to it was Elliot Richardson, who at the time was Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Outstanding individual, really a good supporter of the president, strong, really fine guy, but his institutional base said, you know, you've got to impose that bill. We can't take that out from outside the Department of HEW and make it independent. So Elliot had opposed it. I'd forgotten that until I saw it in a copy of the decision earlier this evening.
Well, you know, you talked about some of the things that were transformational. The fact that I was a presidential appointment was not a political decision. It was a policy issue. To have the director of the National Cancer Institute, much like what we're seeing occurring right now with, quite honestly, Tony Fauci and our ability to deal with COVID, having the ability to be directly interactive and related to the White House and the president and presidential advisors around policies that are going to influence how we're going to address these overwhelming public health problems. And cancer was an overwhelming public health problem at the time, and frankly still is. So I think that the idea of people being concerned that the NCI director is a presidential appointment, it's not a political issue. It's the ability to allow that person to be involved in policies that are going to influence how we're going to deal with this as a society.
I think if the legislation had not drafted the way it was, if it had been left to the agencies, you never would have had the NCI having the contract ability to specify what they wanted. That was the whole new thing. It just would not have happened without the president's directive, number one, and without it reporting directly into the president.
Is there a backstory and significance to the local, to the 15, then 15, and now 71 designated cancer centers? What was the importance and impact of that?
Well, I think that really was a critical ingredient of the success that we've seen in the progress that we've made. And the vision behind that was to be able to create centers in which you had absolute state-of-the-art basic research, wedded to absolute state-of-the-art clinical care, because it was the reality of cancer in the clinical arena that could inform some of the hypotheses that needed to be developed in basic research. And it was the insights that were occurring in basic research that could be translated into how we could do a better job in the clinic. So, for example, when I came to MD Anderson in 1976, and Peter Pisters, the president of MD Anderson, is here, it was not the MD Anderson Cancer Center, it was the MD Anderson Hospital and Tumor Institute. It was one of the first of the 3 cancer centers, and then 15 more were funded through the bill. But the vision was to create these centers where you brought scientists and clinicians together to advance the state-of-the-art of science and advance the state-of-the-art of care. And that was transformational and ingenious in realizing that you needed that symbiotic, continuous information transfer.
What about the sort of non-research areas? One of the things mentioned is a conversation about prevention. And so suddenly, I mean, one of the things that you all know is that cancer was the disease that dare not speak its name for so long. And so just to have a conversation at all about it, I guess, was very important at that time. Now we take a lot of this for granted, but at the time it was groundbreaking.
Well, again, you know, when you think about how it was such a departure from what was tradition, and the NIH is traditionally a basic research entity, and thank God that we have it. We could not live without it. But the NCI had to go beyond that And the National Cancer Act commissioned, authorized the NCI to go beyond just basic research, become involved in cancer control. And so being able to become part of community efforts for tobacco elimination, for example, to begin to get involved in training programs and educational programs around cancer prevention and cancer control, to move into the area of early diagnostics, et cetera. These were additional roles and responsibilities that the NCI had, which would not be thought of as traditional basic research-focused entities. And again, I think we see the wisdom and the genius of some of the things that you incorporated in that bill paying dividends now 50 years later.
And there's things that you and I have talked about that I don't fully understand. There was a database that apparently was what was that and what was the importance of that?
Well, again,
and it didn't exist before?
SEER database, epidemiology and surveillance. It was this extension of, it isn't just a matter of studying cancer in a laboratory. It's understanding what is happening in the reality of cancer in the population at risk and gathering the data to be able to create these databases. So we created surveillance and reporting of epidemiology, incidence, mortality, factors that were contributing to outcomes, be they favorable or unfavorable, all of which feeds into our ability to understand the disease. And you can't solve a problem you don't understand. And you can't solve cancer just understanding it in a mouse or in a petri dish. You got to understand it in a human being. And again, that was some of the genius of the National Cancer Act, to create the environment and the infrastructure that the NCI could drive to make that happen in the community. It's happening out there, but it's happening because the NCI had the authority and the resources to make it happen.
We sit here and with the luxury and benefit of 50 years hindsight. Someone who made it, was present at the creation of it as legislation, and someone who early on implemented it and experienced it as a director of the Cancer Institute. Well, there's many years for. We'll meet again for the 100th anniversary, but for the 50th, what's your summing up of the contribution of the National Cancer Act of 1971?
Well, I think for me, what I've been gifted and privileged to have been able to witness is that the progress that has occurred over the past 50 years by virtue of what the National Cancer Act enabled has helped us understand fundamental mechanisms of not just cancer, but all diseases at the genetic, molecular, and cellular level. So a lot of the progress that we're seeing in cancer is now being transposed to progress in neurologic and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, all chronic and even acute diseases. And I have to go no further than just the fact that we have been able to take a virus and sequence it, and within 6 months, using mRNA technologies, now have vaccines. A lot of the science underneath of all of that was science that was funded through the National Cancer Act.
Exactly.
And I think it's also, from your perspective, an amazing example that we could use today of bipartisanship.
No question. Yeah, I think that Frank, the president, would be extraordinarily pleased if he were here tonight and be able to see this group and understand the progress they have all made and under the legislation that he spearheaded 50 years ago. And I know that the work that you all do and the people that follow you are going to continue to take the approach that's been used and expand it. And we've made great progress in these 50 years. The next 50 years are unbelievable about what we're going to see.
If you don't mind, I'll just take it on a second, because there's someone in the audience, Will Lee, who's president of the Angiogenesis Foundation, worked with Judah Folkman. Judah's concept around abnormal blood vessel growth is that cancer can't grow if it doesn't have blood vessels feeding it. and so we could stop cancer with anti-angiogenesis drugs. Guess what? One of the best applications of the anti-angiogenesis drugs that were developed for cancer through the NCI are now the best treatment for wet macular degeneration of the eye. That's the kind of return on investment that you made possible. Well,
The President made it possible.
You were in the room.
I was a good staff person to help the process along.
Oh, listen, I spent enough time in Washington to know the really important people are the staff people. So,
Oh, you're very kind.
thank you. Thank you.
On that note, I think that's a high note, yeah. Something.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our evening, and we will start again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We invite you all to join us for coffee. And before you go tonight, the galleries will remain open for another hour and 10 minutes. I really would encourage everyone to visit the Fred and Marlene Malik Theater and watch the film and spend some time touring through the museum and see the new cancer exhibit, From Hopelessness to Hope. Thank you for being here tonight, and we'll see you all in the morning. Good night.